Welcome to our channel, where every story is rooted in heart, humanity, and the quiet power of compassion. If you haven't subscribed yet, please take a moment to do so. Tap the bell icon and stay with us weekly as we uncover true and inspired tales that remind us even the smallest act of kindness can change someone's life forever. Today's story is about an old woman who gave what little she had to help a boy she didn't know. And what happened 10 years later left the world speechless. It began on a cold winter morning under a steel-gray sky that sagged low over an old railway station on the outskirts of the city. Snow clung to the rusted benches and the broken clock that hadn't worked since 1984. Commuters rarely stopped here anymore. Only the forgotten came and went. Migrants, drifters, people with stories that didn't fit into resumes or records. Among them was an old woman named Maria. She wore 3 layers of clothing not because she was stylish, but because she couldn't afford heat. Her boots were duct-taped at the soles, her gloves had holes, and in a small paper bag was all she could afford for the day: a single loaf of bread and 2 apples. Maria lived alone in a rundown apartment a block away, surviving on meager pension checks and stubborn hope. Most days she sold trinkets at the corner of the station: old buttons, broken watches, a chipped figurine of St. Anthony. Anything she could find in abandoned bins and clean enough to make $1. On this particular morning, as she sat beside her cardboard sign reading, "Any help is a blessing," she spotted a boy. Thin, dirty, eyes sunken into his pale face, maybe 12 years old, maybe younger. He wasn't begging, he wasn't crying. He was simply staring at the loaf of bread in her hands like it was a miracle wrapped in brown paper. Maria didn't hesitate. She didn't ask where he came from or what he'd done. She just stood up, walked over to him, and gently placed the bread in his arms. "Here," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the wind. "Eat, please." The boy looked up at her, startled, as if the gesture itself didn't make sense in his world. He took the bread, nodded once, and ran, vanishing into the alley like a ghost. Maria returned to her bench, stomach growling but heart strangely full. She never saw him again, or so she thought. What she didn't know was that the boy had been living in an abandoned train car for weeks, surviving on scraps and sheer willpower. He had lost his parents in a fire. No one had claimed him. He had no ID. No name anyone remembered. But he remembered her. He remembered the warmth in her wrinkled eyes, the way her voice cracked when she said please, as if she were asking him to let her be kind. That single loaf of bread didn't just feed his body. It stitched something back together in his soul. It made him believe, even for a moment, that life wasn't entirely cruel. And from that day forward, he made a promise, silent, wordless, but burning like a vow inside him. One day he would return. One day he would find her. And when he did, he would repay her. Not because she asked, but because love like hers deserved to echo the boy who received that loaf of bread. Did not know her name, nor where she lived, nor how to say thank you in any way that mattered. But what he did know was that in a world that had offered him nothing but silence and sorrow, one woman had looked at him and seen a child, not a burden. After he devoured the bread in hungry, shaking hands, he curled up behind a dumpster with the brown paper still clutched to his chest like a keepsake, the warmth of it lingering longer than the food itself. That night, for the first time in weeks, he dreamed. Not of fire or of sirens, but of a home. He had no money, no family, no papers, but he had memory. And that was where he began. The boy started sweeping outside food stalls for scraps. He washed windows with newspaper for a coin or two. He learned to move quickly, speak softly, and watch everything. He listened to people talk about jobs, about systems, about names of places where opportunity might be hiding like sunlight behind clouds. At night, he stayed in shelters, and when none were available, he returned to the alley behind the train station where she had found him. He asked around for her, described her face, her voice, her gloves with the holes, but no one knew. "Lots of old women come through here," they said. "You'll have to be more specific." But he couldn't forget. Couldn't let her become one more thing the world had taken from him. He decided to remember everything. The curve of her smile, the way she said "eat" like it mattered more to her than it did to him. That memory became his compass. Years passed like seasons in fast forward. The boy, who eventually chose the name Elias, found work washing dishes, then fixing bikes, then helping a kind mechanic in a dusty garage who taught him about engines and trust. Elias had a mind like flint. Once struck, he lit up with ideas. He began repairing broken radios, selling refurbished phones out of a pushcart, eventually saving enough for a laptop. He studied at night, taught himself code by watching stolen Wi-Fi tutorials behind cafes. He created his first app at 17, sold it at 18, and by 19, people who once stepped over him on the sidewalk were now pitching him for investment. He didn't smile much. He didn't boast. But deep down, something drove him harder than ambition. The vow. For every dollar he earned, every deal he made, Elias asked himself one question. Is this enough to find her yet? He hired a private investigator when he turned 20. All he had was a date, a rough location, and a memory. But sometimes that's all you need when the heart refuses to forget. It took 7 months. 7 months of dead ends. Old train station records, shelter interviews, and one elderly nun who finally said, "I remember a woman like that. Maria, kind eyes, sold trinkets near the 9th Street platform. Haven't seen her in years." Elias's heart hammered in his chest as the pieces clicked. "Maria," he whispered. The name sounded holy. The investigator tracked down a listing, an old rent-controlled apartment that hadn't been updated in city records in nearly a decade. And one day, 10 years to the week after she gave him bread, Elias stood in front of a creaking door with peeling paint and a brass number faded with time. He had everything now: suits that fit, a company that bore his name, bank accounts with numbers most people could only imagine. But his hand trembled as he knocked, because none of that mattered unless she answered, unless she was still there, unless the promise could finally be fulfilled. The door opened slowly, and standing behind it, thinner, older, but unmistakably her, was Maria. Time had carved new lines into her face, but her eyes were still soft, still kind, still the same ones that had seen him through cold and hunger. She blinked, confused at first. "Can I help you?" He opened his mouth to speak, but no sound came. Instead, he reached into his coat, pulled out a small, carefully folded piece of brown paper, the very same wrapper from that loaf of bread. Her eyes widened, her breath caught. "You," she whispered, stepping closer. "It was you?" He nodded, tears now falling freely. "You saved me. I never forgot." She pressed a hand to her mouth, overcome. "But how? Why?" "Because," he said, voice cracking, "you gave me everything when you had nothing. You gave me kindness, and that saved my life." And just like that, a decade of silence crumbled, and the past stood between them not as a wound, but as a bridge. Maria stood frozen in the doorway, staring at the young man before her, as if time had collapsed into a single moment, a decade compressed into a heartbeat. She could barely reconcile the fragile boy she had once handed a loaf of bread to with the man who now stood tall in front of her, wearing a tailored coat and carrying eyes full of gratitude and pain all at once. Elias stepped forward carefully, unsure if it was okay to cross the threshold of her world again. "Can I come in?" he asked gently, and she stepped aside without a word, motioning him in with trembling hands. The apartment was dim and small, just as the private investigator had described, and yet somehow filled with warmth despite its aging walls and sagging furniture. Faded doilies lined the arms of threadbare chairs. A tiny gas heater clicked in the corner. Photographs, old and curled at the edges, were tacked along the wall like stories no one had listened to in years. Maria gestured to the sofa, still trying to process what was happening. "You're the boy from the station." Elias sat slowly, his voice soft. "You were the first person who looked at me like I mattered." She sank into the chair across from him, hands folded in her lap. "I remember you. You didn't say a word, you just ran." He nodded. "I was scared and starving, but I never forgot. I kept the wrapper from that bread. It was all I had that reminded me people could still be good." A silence hung between them, not awkward but sacred, as if the universe itself was pausing to witness their reunion. Maria leaned forward, her voice cracking. "What happened to you? Where did you go?" Elias told her everything, from the alleyway to the pushcart, from sweeping to studying, from mechanic's assistant to tech innovator. He spoke not to boast, but to trace the thread back to her, to the moment her hand had passed him a loaf of bread without expecting anything in return. She listened with wide eyes, the occasional tear tracing down her cheek. "I never thought I'd see you again," she said. "I didn't even know if you survived." "I did," he said, "because of you." Then he reached into his bag and pulled out a black envelope with gold trim. Maria hesitated as he placed it in her lap. "What is this?" "Something small," Elias said, smiling. "Compared to what you gave me." She opened it slowly, her hands trembling. Inside was a letter and a check. She stared at the number. Her lips moved, but no sound came. The zeros didn't make sense. The signature did. "Elias, I want you to have this," he said. "It's not charity, it's gratitude. You didn't have to help me. You didn't know me, but you saved my life. And now I want to give you yours back." This is too much," Maria stammered. $1 billion? "It's what your kindness is worth to me," he said. "And this is just the beginning." She shook her head, overwhelmed. "But I'm just an old woman. I don't know what to do with all this." "Then let's do something with it together," Elias said. "Let's build something that feeds more than just one child. Let's feed thousands. Let's house them, teach them, give them a chance like you gave me." She looked at him as if she were seeing a sunrise for the first time. "You want me to help?" "You already have," he said. "Now I want the world to see who you are." Maria cried then, for real, her small body shaking under the weight of a life she never expected. She cried not just because of the money or the opportunity, but because for the first time in her long, difficult life, someone had come back for her. Someone had remembered, and that kind of recognition was rarer than gold. Elias stood and offered his hand. "Come with me. I've already bought us a building in the same neighborhood. We'll open a shelter and a school, and we'll name it after you, Maria's Place. A home for anyone who ever needed someone to believe in them." Maria took his hand slowly, rising to her feet like a flower turning toward the sun. "I don't know what to say." "You said enough 10 years ago," Elias whispered, "when you gave me bread." They stood together in the dim light of her apartment, the past and the present holding hands, and outside the snow had started falling again. But this time it didn't feel cold. It felt like a beginning. It started with a single brick, laid not by construction workers but symbolically, by Maria herself, her thin hand guided by Elias as cameras clicked and a small crowd clapped quietly behind them. They stood on the same street where she had once sold broken watches and faded trinkets. Only now, the space was cleared for something greater. Maria's place. The name had been Elias's idea. Because it was always your place first, he'd told her. The building was to be a shelter, yes, but more than that, a sanctuary. A refuge for children like Elias had once been. A school for kids who'd fallen through the cracks. A soup kitchen where no one was asked for a name or a story before receiving a hot meal. The staff? Made up of former shelter residents, retired teachers, volunteers who had once been guests. The walls? Painted with murals of trees, stars, and wide open arms. Every hand here will be seen, Elias said. No one invisible, no one forgotten. Maria visited the site every day, not to oversee but to listen, to sit with the kids as they arrived, some quiet as ghosts, others rowdy with survival. She greeted every one of them with the same kindness she had once shown a boy by the train station. Soft eyes, warm bread, no judgment. The media quickly caught on. News stations ran the story. Billionaire pays tribute to woman who once fed him, builds shelter in her name. Interviews were requested, features published. But Maria refused the spotlight. Tell them to talk about the children, she said. Not about me. When pressed, she said only this. I was just someone who had one loaf of bread and gave it away. He turned that into something beautiful. That's his story. Elias disagreed. It was your love that multiplied it. Word spread quickly. Donations poured in. Corporate partners offered to build second and third shelters. But Elias was firm, come at a time, with intention, with soul. Maria's place was not a brand. It was a beating heart, and that heart beat strongest when no one was looking. At 6 a.m. when Maria brewed tea for the kids who couldn't sleep, or at 10 p.m. when Elias quietly swept the back hallway just to feel connected to the place that reminded him of where he came from. Together they launched scholarship programs, vocational training, therapy for kids who had seen too much too soon. They created a clothing closet filled with donated suits and dresses, each outfit with a note in the pocket that said, "You are worthy. You are seen." Maria insisted on writing those notes by hand. She wrote hundreds. On Sundays they hosted dignity dinners, long tables set with candles and music, where the staff dined with residents not as caretakers and clients but as equals. Laughter returned to lives that had forgotten how to laugh. Slowly, steadily, a miracle took shape, not the flashy kind with spotlights, but the quiet kind that changes the shape of a soul. One rainy afternoon, Elias sat with Maria in the garden behind the shelter, watching as kids ran through puddles in donated boots. I used to think success meant being untouchable, he said. Now I think it just means being useful. Maria smiled, pulling her shawl tighter. Success is love that outlives you. Do you ever wish you had done more for yourself? He asked gently. She looked at him, eyes filled with years. This is for me, she whispered. This joy, this purpose, this is the wealth I never imagined. Elias leaned back and exhaled, the kind of breath that only comes when someone finally feels home. Maria looked up at the gray sky. 10 years ago I gave away my only loaf of bread and went hungry that night, but I never regretted it. Elias turned to her. Why not? Because I believed the world still had good in it, and I'd rather be hungry and kind than full and cold. That sentence would later be etched on the stone arch at the entrance of Maria's place. Every child, every worker, every visitor passed beneath it, and many stopped to read it again and again, not just with their eyes, but with their hearts. What Maria didn't know, couldn't know, was how far the ripple would go. But soon she would, because the world wasn't just watching, it was listening. It began with a single article in a modest online publication, a story titled "The Bread That Built a Future," chronicling how a homeless boy was saved by a stranger's kindness and returned years later to transform her life and thousands more. The piece was simple, written by a volunteer teacher at Maria's Place who had watched the story unfold from behind lesson plans and soup pots. But the simplicity of the words was what made them powerful. Within a week, the article had been shared tens of thousands of times, passed from inbox to inbox, read aloud at family dinners and staff meetings and in classrooms where children were asked to name the kindest person they knew. Soon after, a larger news outlet picked it up, then another, then another. Major TV anchors began telling the story on air. Clips of Elias walking with Maria through the garden, smiling gently as she handed a lunch tray to a shy girl, were replayed across continents. But what caught fire wasn't the money. It wasn't the billion-dollar figure, though that certainly made headlines. It was the image of a woman who had nothing, offering everything. Of a man who could buy the world, choosing instead to build a table for it. Across the globe, something stirred. People wrote in from Kenya, Brazil, India, Australia. Letters arrived at Maria's Place, written in dozens of languages, notes from children who'd given away their lunch that day, from grandparents who remembered their own Maria, from COs who sat weeping at their desks, suddenly ashamed of how far they'd drifted from grace. Elias and Maria never asked for any of it. They turned down endorsement deals, declined awards, avoided political attention. They didn't want to be a symbol. They wanted to stay real. Yet the ripple could not be stopped. Donations poured in, not just in cash but in time. People flew in to volunteer, to study how Maria's Place worked. Soon similar homes were built in 5 other cities, not franchises, not clones, but cousins. Each tailored to its community, each rooted in the same principle: lead with love, not policy. Journalists begged for exclusive interviews. Maria gave one, just one. She sat at a wooden table in the garden, wearing the same shawl she always wore, and said simply, "I gave bread because I was hungry once too. I helped because I hoped someone would have helped me, and now I'm glad I did. But this," she looked around the courtyard where kids were playing, eating, laughing, "this was never my plan, it was my prayer." When asked what she thought of Elias's success, she said, "I think the best thing he ever built wasn't an app. It was a life he wasn't afraid to share." Elias, meanwhile, stayed close to the operations. He had boardrooms to visit, contracts to sign, but he always came home to Maria's Place on Fridays. He spent hours reading bedtime stories, fixing squeaky doors and listening to kids explain their dreams in shy, soft voices. He never wore a suit inside the building. "This place doesn't care who you pretend to be," he once told a visiting donor. "It cares who you are when you're not being what." Slowly, his name became synonymous not just with business, but with integrity. He didn't give handouts. He gave hope. Not in glittering speeches, but in how he sat beside a boy who still flinched when people raised their voices, or how he left handwritten notes for staff, reminding them that they too were seen. Maria once found him wiping tables after dinner. "You don't have to do that," she said. "I know," he smiled, "but I remember what it felt like when no one did." Their bond deepened with time, not just as benefactor and namesake, but as family. Elias called her Mama Maria by then, and the name spread to the children, the staff, even to journalists who no longer asked for a title. She was the grandmother of a movement she never intended to start. And still, she never took credit. "He did this," she always said, but Elias knew the truth. He had built an empire, yes, but she had built him with one act of kindness, one loaf of bread, and every brick they laid afterward was her legacy, not his. Time passed like soft music, gentle, inevitable, carrying Maria and Elias forward on a rhythm neither of them tried to control. The seasons spun, but within the walls of Maria's place something remained timeless. It was in the way children arrived with haunted eyes and left with heads held high. In the way laughter returned to lips that had forgotten how to smile. Maria moved slower now. Her hands, once steady and strong even in poverty, had grown delicate, her breath shorter. But she remained present, always. She didn't attend staff meetings anymore, but she sat in the garden every afternoon, a crocheted shawl over her lap, offering warm smiles to every child who passed. "Come sit," she would say, patting the bench. Then they always did. The younger ones called her Grandma, the older ones, Ms. Maria. No matter the name, the reverence was the same. Elias visited daily now, no longer rushing between boardrooms and shelters. He had stepped down from his company, quietly and without press, choosing instead to walk slower, breathe deeper, and cherish the gift time had given him. More moments with her. They shared meals by candlelight, not because the power went out, but because it felt more peaceful that way. He read aloud to her from books she never had time for in her earlier years. She told stories from her childhood, ones she had buried under decades of hardship. "Do you regret anything?" he asked one evening, as the stars blinked through the windows and the sound of soft piano drifted in from the hallway. Maria thought for a long while, then smiled. "I regret not learning to dance. But I've lived a life that fed people, and that's a kind of dance too." Elias nodded, a lump in his throat. "What about you?" she asked. "What do you regret?" He looked at her, eyes full of the boy he used to be. "Us. That I can't make time stand still," he said. Maria chuckled softly. "It doesn't need to. You've already made it matter." In the final weeks, she grew weaker. Her hands trembled, her voice softened, but her spirit unshaken. She insisted on writing one last letter to the children of Maria's place, though Elias offered to do it for her. "No," she said. "It has to come from these hands. They once gave away bread. Let them give a blessing now." It took her a week to finish it, written in neat cursive, folded and placed in a glass frame to hang in the lobby. It read, "To the children who come through these doors, I don't know your names yet, but I already love you. You matter. You are seen. You are never a burden. If the world tells you otherwise, come here. We will remind you who you are. Always choose kindness, even when it costs, especially when it costs. Love will outlive you if you plant it deep enough. With all my heart, Maria." When she passed, it was quiet, peaceful. Elias was at her side, holding her hand as the sun rose and the light painted her face gold. She smiled one last time and whispered, "I'm proud of you," before her eyes closed. The entire shelter went silent, not with despair, but reverence. Children lit candles, staff stood in rows, hands held. The front gates were open to the public, and people from all over came to say goodbye. Neighbors, strangers, world leaders, celebrities, people she never knew she'd touched. Her funeral was simple, just as she had requested, no press, no spectacle, just flowers, music, and a loaf of bread placed beside her headstone, wrapped in brown paper. Elias delivered the eulogy, his voice cracking as he said, "She never asked to be remembered, but now the world will never forget." He promised then, before the hundreds gathered under that silver sky, that Maria's place would live on, not as a monument, but as a movement. "Not in her name alone," he said, "but in the name of everyone who believes one small act of kindness can change the course of a life." That day, and the days that followed, were not filled with grief. They were filled with stories. People shared the way Maria had smiled at them, how she had fed them, how her words had healed parts of them they didn't know were broken. Her legacy wasn't in the billions Elias gave, it was in the billions of moments her one act had sparked. Years passed, and Maria's place became more than a shelter, it became a symbol. A living reminder that a single act of compassion, offered without expectation, could echo through generations. There were now over 20 centers worldwide, each carrying the same soul as the original. They didn't bear Maria's name out of branding, but out of reverence. And everywhere Elias traveled, he carried a loaf of bread wrapped in brown paper, placing it in the lobby of each new center built, not as decoration, but as a reminder. This, he would say, is where it all began. The children who had once come to Maria's place in silence grew into leaders, educators, nurses, builders, and counselors. They returned as volunteers, mentors, donors. Some even opened their own shelters. Each of them told the same story, in their own way, that someone believed in them when they couldn't believe in themselves, that someone saw them. Elias remained at the heart of it all. He never returned to his tech empire, though it had grown in his absence. Instead, he spent his days writing letters to children, teaching business classes to orphans, and delivering loaves of bread to places where hunger still lived. His net worth no longer made headlines, his impact did. But perhaps the most beautiful thing he did, every year on the anniversary of their meeting, was sit on the same bench outside the old train station where it all began. He would arrive at dawn, dressed in simple clothes, holding a single loaf of bread in his lap. He didn't bring cameras. He didn't make speeches. He just sat, remembering the woman who once gave him everything she had. One year, a child approached him, thin, quiet, eyes hollowed by hunger. Elias didn't hesitate. He broke the loaf in two and handed half to the boy. "Here," he said. "Eat. Please." The boy nodded, took the bread, and ran. Elias smiled, blinking through tears. The world had changed, but not enough. And so he kept showing up, kept giving, kept remembering. Because Maria hadn't saved him for a moment. She had saved him for a mission, and now it was his turn to pass that love forward. The quote above the doors of every Maria's place read, "Kindness costs little, but changes everything." And if this story has moved you, if you feel something inside you stirring, then remember this. You don't need $1 billion to change the world. You don't need to build a shelter or launch a foundation. Sometimes all it takes is one small act, one kind word, one piece of bread. Because love, when given freely, becomes a seed, and if you plant it with your whole heart, it will feed someone long after you're gone. If this story touched you, inspired you, or reminded you of what truly matters, please take a moment to subscribe to this channel. Share it with someone who needs to hear that they matter. And always remember, the smallest act of compassion you offer today may become the greatest gift someone ever receives. Thank you for watching.